nothing really. I wanted to write and learn about my grandfather, who I never knew. He died on Christmas Eve of 1958. My mom's dad is from Cincinnati, and he played one game of Major League Baseball. Not even one game. He played one inning of one game. Never got in that bat. He was a defensive replacement as catcher for the New York Giants against the Pittsburgh Pirates in June of 1926 at the Polo Grounds on a Sunday afternoon. So I looked up everything about all the accounts of that game, and we had a copy of his contract. He was up all that summer with the Giants, John McGraw's Giants. There were a bunch of Hall of Famers on that team. Mel Ott was 17 years old. And I wanted to learn more about what his life was like. And my uncle, his son, my mom's only brother, my uncle Pat, who lives in Reno, sent me, he never told me he had this, but he sent me his catcher's mitt, this that he wore that day at the Polo Grounds. And this UPS package arrived one afternoon, and I opened it up, and I took all the packing peanuts out, and it was this. And I put it on, and it, as I've done many times since, and it fits. You can see there's nothing to it, really. And but it was like shaking hands left-handed for the first time with my grandfather, because it was molded to his hand. He wore this in college at Xavier in Cincinnati, and then again in his professional career. And I did what everybody does with a mitt, is like, you know, put it over my nose and mouth like an airplane oxygen mask, and it smells great. You're barely able to make out the trademark. It's Lowe and Campbell was a company. I looked them up. They had retail stores in 5 cities. One of them was Cincinnati. It's not hard to imagine him buying this in Cincinnati in the 19-teens. And he had a brother who played several years in the big leagues. My grandfather's name was Jimmy Boyle. His brother's name was Ralph Buzz Boyle. He played for the Boston Braves and the Brooklyn Dodgers. So I started to research him, and the theme that kept coming up were different objects, starting with this catcher's mitt. And Buzz played left field for the Dodgers. Casey Stengel's first year as manager in the early 1930s. And his last season was in 1935. He was traded to the Yankees and spent a bunch of years in their minor league system into the 1940s. They had a pretty solid outfield. And but one day, in February of 1936, 2 cops were walking a beat beyond the right field wall at Ebbets Field in Brooklyn. I have since walked the same block. It's very different now, but it's that street is there. And they saw over the right field wall, they noticed a dozen bats come from inside the park over the right field wall. So they stayed there and watched, and then they saw a pair of Brooklyn Dodgers uniform pants go over the wall and flutter to the sidewalk, and they just stayed there at the sidewalk and waited, and then 3 kids scrambled over the wall behind the equipment. And there were 2 cops, and each cop grabbed 1 kid, and the third got away. And one of the kids, who was 15 years old, and this is from a contemporary newspaper account in the New York Times, was taken to Bellevue for observation. And they were my Uncle Buzz's uniform pants with Boyle stitched into the waistband. And I thought, you know, I would have been taken to Bellevue at that age also, because I was, you know, I didn't see anything wrong with, you know, wanting to have a Major League Baseball player's uniform pants or a dozen bats from the Brooklyn Dodgers. I perfectly understood, because when I was a kid, I worked at the Minnesota Twins Stadium in Bloomington, Minnesota. That's the town, my hometown. And the Twins played outdoors there, and we were the guys. My 13th birthday, I got a card identifying me as an employee of the Twins. My 2 older brothers worked in the commissary. We made the food that the vendors sold. And so when I would punch in the tunnel at Met Stadium, you know, there would be pallets of Grain Belt beer, and we'd have cases of frozen Schweigert hot dogs that we'd put in this walk-in freezer where my oldest brother, who was one of the managers would punish us by forcing us to sit in a walk-in freezer. I don't advise, I think it's that there were all kinds of OSHA violations going on there, let's just say that. But there would be broken bats in laundry trundles in that tunnel. There would be crates of Rawlings baseballs, brand new, you know, just like cartons of white eggs, these pristine baseballs. And it was like a Willy Wonka factory for baseball. And I got to work there every Twins home game and Vikings home games for 3 years. So I became really just as any kid would, even now to this day. I knew then it would be the best job that I ever had, and it has remained so. But so I just got in my head thinking of all these ideas about writing a book about the objects of baseball, where they came from, people behind them, and also hoping in the course of doing that to learn more about the world at large, the United States. So much of this history is tied into you know, larger American history, and the Polo Grounds I noticed kept coming up repeatedly. Cracker Jack over there. When I see the Cracker Jack, it immediately makes you think of Taking Out to the Ball Game. And Jack Norworth was a Tin Pan Alley songwriter who was on the 9th Avenue L going past the Polo Grounds one day. Had no interest in baseball, never been to a baseball game. Saw the marquee outside the Polo Grounds that said, you know, ball game today, Giants playing whoever. And while he was still on the subway, he wrote Taking Out to the Ball. He wrote the lyrics to Taking Out to the Ball Game. This guy Albert von Tilzer, who was his songwriting partner, set it to music, and it instantly became a huge hit. These two guys maintained their absolute, complete apathy towards baseball and never attended a baseball game until 25 years later, when the Brooklyn Dodgers had a Take Me Out to the Ball Game day and honored them at the ballpark. And in fact, and there's no evidence that they ever went to another game after that. And von Tilzer, who wrote the music, he died on October 1st, 1956. And that night, he was in bed watching the Ed Sullivan Show. Ed Sullivan had, the World Series was opening in New York that week, and he had as his guests a bunch of baseball players who were played on stage to Take Me Out to the Ball Game. Yeah. And the last music he heard on earth was the song that he had written 48 years earlier. And you know, it's obviously played the games to this day, and the guy, as far as I know, never attended more than a single ball game that he was sort of compelled to attend. So, you know, it's just fun learning about these things. Stirrups, that was a question people often had, was never really gave much thought to, but when I was a kid playing Little League, you know, the ritual of putting on the uniform, you put on these white socks and you put the stirrups on over them. And, you know, particularly when I was 8, they certainly didn't serve any purpose, but you know, they went out of fashion a little bit in the 80s and 90s. They're sort of coming back, but why do they exist? Well, when in 1905, Napoleon Lajoie was a great hitter for the Cleveland Indians. He was spiked in the shin. There's a photograph of him in the book convalescing on his porch, and he's got his leg in a cast, and he's sitting in a wheelchair. And there was a big fear among players then, obviously from almost the very beginning. Well, from the very beginning, the very first professional baseball team, the Cincinnati Red Stockings in 1869, the first fully professional team. These teams were identified by the color of their socks, and they always wore colorful socks. The Detroit Tigers got the name Tigers because they wore orange and black striped socks. But there was a fear when these guys got spiked. They were frequently out with what the newspapers called blood poisoning, and these players feared that their blood was being poisoned by the dye of their socks bleeding into their wound after they'd been spiked. And so in this photo of Lajoie, he's with his leg up. That was you know, he was diagnosed with blood poisoning, and in fact, the most famous case of this was 1924. President Calvin Coolidge, his son Calvin Jr., played tennis on the White House lawn. There was a lawn tennis court on the White House lawn, and he developed a blister and died a week later. Big national tragedy. He was 16 years old. Coolidge said, you know, all of the light went out of his life when that happened. But the rumor spread around the United States that he had died because he was wearing black socks with his tennis shoes. In fact, he wasn't wearing any socks at all, but that's how fearful people were that these, before there were color-fast dyes, that these dyes would bleed into the wound and could kill you. So we don't know which first team did it, but these teams started keeping the colorful socks on, but cutting out this half moon in front and back and putting on white, quote, sanitary socks underneath those socks. And obviously they wore these hot leather shoes, and you know, the heat of these ball games was insane. So, you know, you just had the little strap that went under the sanitary sock, so your feet weren't completely overheating. You know, reading about that led to, well, why would these guys wear something that was completely unsuited to hot 100-degree summer days in St. Louis to play baseball in? These flannel uniforms, 8 ounces to the yard, that guys were frequently passing out with heat prostration and being literally carried off the field. The Chicago Cubs wore basically black road uniforms with a big leather belt cinched in the middle, and Frank Chance once passed out in Cincinnati on a 100-and-some degree day and was in the hospital for several days after that. And you know, all of these questions kind of I wanted to answer in the course of researching this book. So I went to the Cooperstown